Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Talim. We are excited to have our dear brother Bill Chambers present today uh, on the religious and racial history of U.S. immigration. Before I turn it over to Brother Bill, I'd like to open up with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa bil alamin. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas sirata mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen.
Amin.
On behalf of Masjid Al-Taqwa's Talim Committee, Dr. Gloria Bashir, Dr. Aisha El-Amin, and Sister Rashida Fitzpatrick, my name is Lionel Allen, and again, welcoming you today to our Talim, where we focus on the religious and racial history of U.S. immigration, presented by Bill Chambers. So at this time, I would like to turn it over. Thank you, Brother Bill, for being here and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us as always.
Thanks, Dr. Lionel. Well, first, assalamu alaikum to everybody that was able to make it. And as Dr. Lionel mentioned, this will be on tape. So um, actually, this ends up being a really crucial timing for this presentation, and inshallah, you'll see what I mean by that when I go through the slides here. And I'll have to say in advance, I usually don't like putting so many words and text, and usually try to mix it up with a photograph or whatever. But I wasn't really able to do that this time because I thought it was a little bit more important to get it out there. Let's see. This is something that, for those of you who have read my book, you'll see a lot of this in there. And I just wanted to use this as an introduction to this history that I'm going to be talking about. And I think everybody knows that social justice is a core Islamic principle. And the way I look at these two quotes, one a quote and one a ayah from the Quran, this reflects, I believe, Islam's view of people coming into our country, how they should be treated, and so on. And it's also one of my personal values that I have. So, if we look at the first one, this is, very, very, everybody knows this particular ayah from the Quran. And I think that the most important part of this is that when Allah made us into races and tribes, the point of that was so we would get to know one another. You can't get to know one another unless you're recognizing that other person. You recognize that they're an individual, that they have a culture that is something that you need to try to understand. And I would go to the second point, and I think that, well, actually, Brother Bashir and I were having a long discussion about this at Juma on Friday. But it's this quote that'll probably be familiar to anyone that was in the Nation of Islam and beyond, that you really need to provide every person with dignity, equality, and justice. And as I said, this is one of my own personal values that I try to do in every day of my life, because these are things that every person deserves. And particular on this topic, doesn't matter how they came into this country, whether they were forced here or came on their own accord, and so on. Everybody needs to be approached with the dignity and that they have as a human being. So I'll just leave that there and talk about talk about our next. Let's see. I don't know why the. Well, I guess I'll just have to use that. Okay. One of the things that I wanted to talk about first is what do I mean by immigration? Because my definition is a little broader than what most people often talk about. So there's two types of immigration. There's voluntary immigration and involuntary. So voluntary is clearly I've chose to come here. I've come here for my family. I've come here for the opportunity it's going to give me. Um, there really isn't any person or that's forcing me to come here. So that's voluntary. And as you know, many of the people who come to this country are involuntary immigrants. And some of these are obvious. Obviously, if you were a slave, you were forced to come here. And if you were an indentured servant, this was something that they had really more in the 18th, 1800s and so on. And actually, a lot of Irish people came here under that, where you agreed to work for some person or company or whatever for 2 or 3 years before you were let free, before you could become a free citizen. Interestingly enough, um, both of those categories, let's say, are still happening. We know that there are people that are brought here to be slaves, whether it's sex slaves or to work in a sweatshop or a factory or whatever. And there's also very similar people that are here as an indentured servant. Okay, our contract with you is that you're going to come here and you're going to work for this company for this many years, and then we'll let you go. Well, and as you know, a lot of those people end up you have to work for this many years, and then you have to pay off the time that you're here, and somehow you're never able to do that. So it kind of turns into slavery. The other category that people do talk about, but they don't recognize it enough, is people that are fleeing from oppression or violence. I would suggest that the majority of people coming into the United States now are fleeing from oppression or violence. It could be from the Middle East, it could be from Africa, it could be from Central America, South America. They're not choosing to come here. They're being forced to because their life is at risk, or their family's life is at risk, or some uh, person or government has taken over and is focusing on them. Um, so my feeling is, and I think it's more than a feeling, that most of the people now come here on an involuntary basis. Now, there's the other part of this when we get into legal issues, where you're here legally, you go through the whole process, and whatever that happens to be, and that's changed over the years, or you're undocumented. You've come over from the Rio Grande, you've come over from wherever. And, as you know, we have many undocumented people that have been here for, many years. The other question is, for the people that are here, is there any path to citizenship for you? And that's been in the news quite a bit. Um, for most people, there is not. Um, and especially for people that have come here as undocumented, the Congress has argued about that for a long time, but has never really created one. And the last one, they had uh, both Republicans and Democrats got together. This was just in the last few months to create a immigration law, but our new President Trump decided that no, he didn't think that was good, so the Republican leaders squashed it. The other part that people often don't think about when we talk about immigration, there's that whole issue of people that have temporary visas. That many of them are for work, many of them for our students, and they can be revoked at any time. So one of the things that was happening actually earlier this month, many of the universities and colleges in the country that make probably even the majority of their money from international students, because international students pay, full fare, so to speak. They were telling their international students that even if your semester hasn't started yet, you really need to get here before President Trump's inauguration, because there's a possibility you might not be able to leave and come back. So there's been a lot of discussion from Trump, and we'll talk about what's going to happen to these kind of visas, or at least what he has planned for that. So when I look at U.S. Immigration history, the the three main factors that you can see as a consistent theme across all of U.S. immigration history is religion, race, and usefulness. Now, when I talk about religion, um, this might be a little hard to do, but uh, anybody here that can name the top two religions, the first one and the second one that came here? I don't know how you would do that, but I can make it. Okay, I'll answer my
Christianity.
own. What's that?
Said Christianity.
Yep, that's
Christians.
number one.
Yeah.
What's number two? Just take a guess.
Islam.
Islam.
Yes, Islam. Yeah, whoever said that, you're absolutely right. So there was a period of time when a number of individuals typically from West Africa, that came to the very early United States and so on, and and they obviously brought their religions with them. The other very large group that people forget is all the slaves that were brought here. Um, and I remember some other presenter talked about this statistic, but it's been confirmed by, if anybody's interested, I've got a really good book that you can read on this. But anyway, the estimate of the percentage of slaves that came from Africa to the Americas, mostly the Caribbean and the United States, the 30% of those were Muslims. And of course, if you probably know that, I mean, most of the slaves came from West Africa, and West Africa is primarily Muslim, and certainly at that time had, during the time of the slave trade, had a very sophisticated um, Muslim civilization. But what happened was, of course, when slaves were brought here by force, they were forced to um, convert to Christianity. So there is some indication, which I kind of like this idea that the majority of slave revolts, and there were many slave revolts, um, were led by Muslims. Because again, if you think about it, I mean, these were people, they came from an advanced civilization. They they usually were able to read, and obviously many of them could read the Quran. Um, and they had a strong identity. So So we'll kind of continue that point a little bit later, but the other thing is that religion has also been used as some kind of limit, that you can't come here. And again, it's usually if you're Muslim, you can't come here because you're Muslim. And sometimes it's like in the last Trump ban of Muslim majority countries, it's not, well, um, we're not, excuse me, we're not denying Muslims coming to the United States. We just happen to pick these Muslim majority countries that we're going to say hey, no one from that country can come. So that's typically how it goes. But you'll see in the U.S. history, religion has also been used often as something that's been a restriction. The other very large one is race, and of course I have race in parentheses because, again, as we all know, race is a social construct. The idea of being white, also in parentheses, was always preferred throughout the whole history of U.S. immigration. But what changes is who's considered white. So often there's a group of people that come in and they're really not considered white or privileged or whatever, but over time they're accepted into the society, and if they fill out the forms, um, they would put white on there. And again, obviously, we'll talk about that. The other important one is usefulness. So many times, people how the immigration law is constructed is based on, is this a group of people that we can let into the country because they're going to serve some useful function. And you're going to hear about that, about the Chinese, for example, that helped build the railroads and so on. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But if you're useful, that can trump religion and race. And as an example, that's still being talked about. You'll hear Musk and soon to be President Trump talking about, well, what we really want is skilled workers, and we want, people that are very involved in technology and so on, and we don't really want anybody else. So that's a pretty common thing. The other thing that we need to talk about is the whole legal and social construction of citizenship. So I'm going to talk about the legal citizenship first. So that definitely changed over time. And this is, there were a number of laws, immigration laws, that were passed over the last couple hundred years. Um, and a lot of those laws changed acceptance legally to be a citizen based on race or religion or country of origin or birthright or whatever. And there is still out there, and you'll hear sometimes people like Trump and that talking about this. There is an ability for citizenship to be revoked. So even if you're a legal citizen, it's potential that you could be designated as somebody who should be kicked out of the country. Now I'm going to talk about social citizenship, which basically means, and I forget who this quote is from, but it's in my book somewhere. But it's basically the idea, you can be invited to the table, but that doesn't mean you are welcome. There are other versions of this, you're invited to the table, but that might mean you're on the menu. Um, so it's the idea that you follow the legal procedure and you're a legal citizen of the United States. Well, that doesn't mean that you're a citizen with full rights, movement, or running for office, or voting, or whatever. And obviously, we've seen suppression of certainly voting for a very long period of time. Obviously, even the African American community, and everybody there is a U.S. citizen. So okay, so just because you've got to that point, and the next thing talks about that. I mean, there's many people that are born citizens, Native Americans and African Americans, Mexicans, and so on, but they really don't have the full rights of a citizen. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about a social construction of citizenship. And often, as you can see at the bottom, there's some kind of polarized racial hierarchy. Probably in the past few decades, with some exceptions there, Asians have kind of joined Europeans at the top. And this is kind of related to, well, Asians are Asians, but they're kind of like honorary white people that they have all of these various various options. So, and then if you're from the Caribbean, or you're Latin American, or you're from Africa, you're at the bottom of this social construction. This is one thing I also mentioned in my book, but I think it's very, very important. And you can see the reference there. After World War II, there was this whole idea of there being an American civic religion, and that's where there were pieces of this before, but some things were added to it. So this is the expectation: if you're a real American, um, you'd be white and you'd be Christian. I say preferred, it's almost kind of a requirement, but also there's this amorphous concept of loyalty to American democratic values. Whatever though it happened to be, it was always kind of a vague thing. And after 9/11, we certainly heard that Muslims don't believe in democracy and don't have the same values we have, and so on. So that's kind of where that comes from. And obviously, then they're not real Americans. Um, so the post 9/11 period, I'm not going to talk a lot about because people are very aware of what happened during that time. But Zarina Gowal, who I know well, and this is a very good book, um, has a good description that and Dearborn in Michigan, as most people know, is mostly Arab and Muslim and so on. Um, so everybody there, I mean, they understand that being citizen is more than just legal status, and that national belonging is fragile and can be withheld from anybody who the government decides is foreign and different, even if you're technically legal citizens. And we'll certainly see a number of times when that that happened. So, for example, there's been many periods in history where people are made into foreigners, and this can be clearly, obviously, immigrants coming into the country, um, but as well as groups within the country. The example I gave after 9/11, and if you're Muslim, and usually, this designation of somebody being a foreigner is usually used as some kind of political strategy. There are a lot of nativist parties in the early U.S. history, and certainly nativists meaning only the real Americans, which would be the white Europeans and whatever, and everybody else is a foreigner. And obviously, you can see Trump using this same type of thing. He's very focused on foreigners, and half the time you think he's talking about Mexicans too, generally. So the the label of foreigners that's usually provided to groups of people that are actually within the country, and you can read that yourself. Um, the political minorities, this isn't so true now, but very early on in the 1900s, and if you listen to my history of the FBI, socialists and communists were considered foreigners. Didn't matter, they thought, oh, they're from Russia or whatever, and they were heavily, heavily persecuted. Um, now, every once in a while, my little thing decides it's not going to advance. Okay, so let's talk about some of the history. So very early on, immigration was really unregulated. So you can see here in the colonial America period, being a citizen was really, you're a freeborn white person, you're loyal to the U.S. But over time, there started to be these categorizations of race um, being added. So if we go into a little bit more detail about that, and I just want to make a comment. I've always found study of the Puritans and the religion that they believed in um, actually rather fascinating. One of the things that remember, you said, they were the first Christians that came to the United States and Massachusetts area and so on. And the Puritans were a religious sect that was being aggressively oppressed by the Church of England at this time. They were tortured, thrown in jail, all that kind of thing. So they came over to America for freedom of religion, so they could do whatever they want and nobody was going to throw them in jail. Well, unfortunately, they have this Calvinist theology, and the best way to think of it is um, before time began, um, God decided who was going to be saved and who wasn't. And they used the word elect. So you were either part of the elect and you'd go to paradise, or you worked and then, you were damned to hell and so on. And they didn't believe, you can't do anything about it. It doesn't matter whether you're the most pious person or so on. If you're not elect, then well, too bad for you. So it's very, very restrictive. And if you get this idea, it's built on, well, there's this elite, right? So after a while, they would say, well, he or she, they're very pious people, and they probably are elect. So they would start going in that direction, and then which won't be a surprise, like the primary Puritan families, let's say well, literally the elite that were running everything, um, it started, you got the impression as the society evolved that, well, really people from that same family who were our leaders, and they're obviously elect. Well, if you're their son or daughter, you probably are too. Well, you can imagine how this like sets up an automatic people at the top and everybody else down here. So what they did is, also if you were a Quaker or um, another religious sect, you were persecuted by the Puritans, and most of them would, like Quakers, for example, would run off to what's now Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, where they would be left alone. So in the very beginning, in terms of immigration, there weren't very much very few restrictions, big need for labor, but there was still this feeling, I don't know, they don't speak our language, and it's us and them, and so that started very early on, and basically never stopped. Um, Continuing on, the very first Immigration Act was in 1795, and you can read these requirements. Um, and obviously, this didn't apply to anybody who was not white. Um, and also, particularly in the beginning, you had to own property. So even if you were white, okay, you're a poor white, but you don't own anything, well, or you're coming into the country and you really don't have any money or whatever, well, we're not necessarily going to let you in unless we need a lot of carpenters now, and you're a carpenter. Okay, we might let you in for that reason. So in 1798, this Alien Enemies Act was created because I mentioned these nativist parties that, we don't want anybody here because this is our land and we're European and we're white and so on. They lobbied to get this passed. And basically, what it meant was the government or even the president could declare that somebody or a particular group is an alien enemy, and they could deport them or not let them into the United States. And if you read, and I'll come back to this later, this is something that Trump is actually considering to get around the 14th Amendment that, if you were born here, you become a citizen. So it's kind of a scary thing that he's considering. So during the one period of time, you can see the laws started to become very strict. 1866 with the 14th Amendment. So that's the one that basically says if you're born here, it doesn't matter the status of your parents, you're a citizen. Well, even then, well, you're not if you're Japanese and Chinese. So they were excluded. Now later they were included back in again. So you can see at the bottom, this led to only about 1% of Europeans were denied. So that's the law. The law did exactly what it was designed to do. So if you go from like 1870s to the 1920s, you can just see those figures there. I mean, 35 to 50 million Europeans and 1 million basically from everywhere else. Um, and this was the time you would think that they would want more, cheap labor. But they mainly wanted European cheap labor. This would be like the Irish and Italians and people like that they would decide to let in. There was a big movement to stop Chinese immigration. What happened initially, and again, this is in the 1870s period, the Chinese were let into the West Coast primarily to help build the railroads and a lot of other, countrywide projects and so on. And once they were done with those, people didn't want them here. So, so 1882, they're done building the railroad, and okay, we're going to stop all Chinese immigration, and that was extended for a very long period of time. And any Chinese who were here were all deported. And so, as you can see at the bottom, in 1892, there were more things added to this restricted list, and most of them were based on either do we need your skill, or what's your racial backup or background. So this is where you get, now we're into the 1920s. The Immigration Act of 1924, it just banned all Asian immigrants. I mean, didn't matter where you came from, an Asian, they decided, okay, we don't want any Asians here. So they were the first group that was prohibited based on race from the U.S. And most of the immigration laws after that, they use racism or religion or poverty to structure what ended up a quota system. So as you kind of saw on the previous slide, countries in Europe, I don't know, they would have 80% of the quota, and then everybody else would have 20. Or in this country, you really don't want to have people from, and we'll give them 1% quota. So that's how these things were managed. The big change happened in 1965, where for the first time the immigration was pushed out to the non-European world. And from a Islam point of view, that's where you can even see, like around Chicago, a good example is I live in Villa Park, and there's a very, very large Islamic Foundation, I believe it's called, very, very large South Asian, mainly Pakistani mosque. They have a school, very beautiful, very large. Well, that's the result of this 1965 leaving things open for the rest of the world to come in, and a lot of the people that came in at that time, were doctors and lawyers and that type of thing. You can kind of see the massive waves of voluntary immigration, and I still don't wonder about that voluntary, but that's when those occurred. Um, I'm putting this, this slide in there uh, because it does talk about Sherman Jackson, who I think many of you know, um, his kind of attitude or review of what happened after 9/11. And again, you're probably tired of me saying this, but this is something I do talk about it in my book. And this, what happened after 9/11 when you know Muslims became this suspect class, as it's mentioned later. A lot of the, let's call it, recent immigrant um, Muslims, they decided, okay, we're gonna stay back. We're going to support the state. We're not going to challenge anything that's happening. At the time, you probably remember people would put up U.S. flags and so on. So Sherman Jackson's point is that immigrant Muslims became a suspect class, whether they, were a doctor or not, or where they came from. And at least at that time, their chances of penetrating the white supremacy in the U.S. was nil. Okay, you can look at you and you're still not white. I don't care whether you're a doctor or whatever you are, and especially you're a Muslim. So there was a lot of that going on during that uh, period of time. Now I want to talk about major trends in American immigration, and I'll go through some of these fairly quickly because there's some piece at the end I want to make sure we cover. When you hear President Trump talking about, he's going to have these massive deportations, this is nothing new. This has happened throughout U.S. history and throughout the American immigration experience. So we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that was, you can see, that was the first law to really put these just broad restrictions. And then in the 1929, 1935, there were a large number of Mexicans that were just deported out of the country. And I can't tell you exactly why that was. I mean, that was probably about a fifth of all Mexicans that were in the United States. They just deported them. Um, and the other example is in 2001, and many of you are probably aware of it, that right after 9/11, the government sent out all these requests for interviews and so on to people that they saw were Arabs, South Asians, or they were Muslims or whatever. And, people would show up and they deported thousands of Muslims and Arabs and South Asians, because they didn't care, oh, you're Hindu. Well, I don't know, you look like a Muslim, so we're going to deport you anyway. Um, there were many, many people who were deported during that time. So Trump is not, he's kind of acting on unfortunately, a trend that's been going on in American history for quite a long time. So the current period, and I know that's a long current period, but um, the majority of people coming here do enter illegally. If you look at the numbers, and most of the immigrants are non-white, and I would say non-European. Um, part of the issue during this period, and it's gone up and down, there's somewhat less opportunity because the U.S. economy was going up and down. So some of the earlier immigrants did well because the economy was doing pretty well and they could get themselves into the middle class. But obviously, the people coming in now, there's just service jobs, working at McDonald's or whatever is about all that they can get. And we talked about post 9/11, um, and 2024, this was really a national phenomenon. This public rejection of immigrants. I mean, I talked to people in Chicago, and they would say, we're getting all these buses from Texas, and they're dumping all these immigrants here in Chicago, and our mayor's, trying to get money to put all these people up in hotels and that type of thing. And well, what about our community? Our community's been underfunded for years, and how does this work? Um, so I'm not making any value judgment of that attitude. It's understandable, but what did happen is that Trump used that politically. I would say that was his number one issue that he linked into, and obviously he beat Kamala Harris and President Biden over the head with. We'll go to the next one here. So, as you probably gather from this brief review of the history, um, there's a lot of myths and realities about acceptance. I mean, I think all of us at this point realize we're not, the America is not a melting pot, and is not reaching out its arms to, the world's poor and so on. Like even Ellis Island, you go there, and I haven't been there myself, but I heard it's very, very impressive, and all the people that came through there. Well, yeah, again, you have to remember those are all European immigrants for the great majority. And Angel Island is the Ellis Island of the West Coast. That's where a lot of Asian immigrants came into the United States. Well, we've already talked about how some of those Asians were treated when they were immigrants. They, were used for their work, and then they were deported, or they were denied coming into the country at all. Or if they were Japanese, they were put in a concentration camp during World War II. So, Angel Island is not exactly um, a success story. And then we've talked a lot about the redefinition of being white over time. And it's very clear that there's this cycle of open and closed borders. And it looks like now we're going to go into a cycle of closed borders, or at least highly restricted borders. This is the part I wanted to make sure we talked about. And I want to talk about what Trump's plans are. Some of these for sure he's going to do, and his one of his number one plans is to focus on this large scale deportations. So a lot of people say, well, I don't know how he's going to do that. We haven't done that before. Well, okay, that's not really true. Um, and his target supposedly is criminals. And of course, the first thing you think of, oh, he's mainly going after, people who commit felonies. Well, the guy, and I can't remember his name, that's head of basically head of ICE, and putting this plan into effect. So he talks about, well, even if it's a misdemeanor, somebody that's had a traffic ticket or shoplifting or whatever, that can still be used as a reason to capture them and deport them. And he's also said anyone around them. Well, okay, maybe they pick a person up when he's in his house. Well, they're going to question the whole family and pick as many people as they can. Now, one of the other things that he said, that they're going to go after sanctuary cities first. And this information here, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about it, but um, some of the news media found out what some of the plans are, and lo and behold, Chicago is one of the first targets. And the information that's out in the news now, and who knows, they'll probably just go ahead with it just to show that they can. So this is on Tuesday. ICE is planning on sending about 100 to 200 officers to arrest about 300 people throughout Chicago. And like I said, in the next slide, I'll talk about that in a little bit more. The other thing that's happening is for these deportations, a lot of the red states are letting their law enforcement cooperate with ICE, which is, again, not surprising. Um, but this is where I guess we can feel lucky that we're in a sanctuary city, and we have the mayor and the governor that we have. Um, one of the other one of the other quick things here that he wants to restrict the 14th Amendment that we talked about by using that Alien Enemies Act. We've talked about that already. There's been a lot of discussion about declaring a national emergency so we can add Pentagon resources to the border, which could be National Guard. He's even talked about using the Army, even though that's against the Constitution. But we'll have to see. Travel bans are probably very, very likely that the Muslim ban that we had the first time he was president will probably happen again, and that a lot of student visas will most likely be canceled from certain countries. Well, we don't want people from that country coming here to study, and the kind of people we want, as I said before, are skilled people, and so that's how they're presenting this. Um, Today, actually, I found out, and this is from one of the main immigration groups that's been working on this for a while, that the raid that's going to be on Tuesday, the likelihood is going to target people going to work or coming back from work, and you can see that the time frame. Supposedly, they're looking for individuals with outstanding warrants, but they can still go pick up somebody without a warrant. Um, so the Chicago Police Department is not going to participate, um, but they also won't interfere with anything that was happening. And luckily, the city council voted an attempt to have the Chicago Police Department help ICE, but that was defeated. The other thing to remember here is that ICE agents are typically in plain clothes. It's not like they're the FBI and they got a big FBI on their back, and they could just call your name while you're walking around on the street. So most likely, what some of this is going to happen is there'll be some communities people are not going to go to work. They're not going to go to school. A lot of this happened the last time. There was a lot of raids in Chicago and the Pilsen community and Little Village and that type of thing. Um, this is a Know Your Rights, and that's the Illinois Coalition that's published this and where I got that information from. Before we leave, I'll put that in the chat. It really tells you, what to do if they're at your door, you encounter them, you don't sign anything, if you're detained, and they have a whole family support um, hotline. And as you can tell, maybe at the bottom there, they're staffed with English, Spanish, Polish, Arabic, and Korean speakers. So all these organizations are getting ready for this. Um, And the last couple things I wanted to talk about, what do we need to do, or what are some people doing to stop Trump's plans? One issue is that he's going to need a lot of funds to do this huge increase in detention centers, because you can't arrest this many people without building more of them. But as a good capitalist society, of course, there's all these companies lining up to build them. A lot of sanctuary cities, like Chicago, they're going to refuse to work with ICE. Um, a lot of the immigration groups already have kind of a warning system. If they see ICE people in the area or whatever, they've kind of got that covered. I can see a lot of protests blocking detention centers. A lot of legal organizations, ACLU and like CARE Chicago, are already set up to do this. And mainly what they're going to do is just do legal challenge after legal challenge. And hopefully some of that can be, some of what's going on can be halted. But as we all remember, we got a Supreme Court that's very conservative. Um, if there's a travel ban, turning out for the airports. Last time, CARE Chicago did a fantastic job at covering that, so people can put that out there. And the very last thing I just wanted to say is um, we all really need to do what we can to protect the immigrants that are in our communities. And even the immigrants that aren't in our communities. This is going to be, the level of fear uh, that's been going on since Trump was elected. There's a lot of people that are just, terrified, and they have a good reason to be. Um, so anything that you can do, if you know people where you live or whatever, make sure they're okay, or make sure that they have some of that information that I just put up there. Let's see if I can stop sharing here this for a minute. Okay. One of the things I want to do actually while we're talking here, I'm going to put that image up of the. Let's see if I can do this. Now, I need to end the show. Sorry. While I'm doing this, um, anybody have any questions or thoughts or whatever?
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Bill.
Alaikum assalam.
Thank you for the presentation and the valuable information you provided. I have a number of thoughts because you covered a lot of territory. And because you covered a lot of territory, I need to limit my thoughts to what I think is might be relevant. You are speaking to a group primarily of African American Muslims.
Mhm.
Much of your conversation revolved around the history of the Puritans, the Mormons, the Jews, and others. You didn't mention the Jews so much, but you mentioned the hierarchy in religious thought. Basically, with the Puritans believing in this hierarchy. But I was reflecting on not just the Puritans, but others who have built this hierarchy where they put themselves on top of the hierarchy. They're the chosen one. The 144,000 are the ones that will pretty much govern everything. So that's something that has happened throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to correct the record though on the Europeans, the Europeans, Americans, etc., bringing slaves to the United States. The position I take is that they did not bring slaves to the United States. They brought free people and made them slaves.
Yeah.
And so I think
very good correction.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at it from that perspective. And in reference to African American Muslims, particularly Muslims in our association, we consider ourselves the best American citizens in terms of American values. Although there's this effort to identify Muslims primarily as immigrants or from somewhere else, the African American Muslim community is not really looked upon in that respect. So we consider ourselves the best of the American citizens. And lastly, those who are talking about these American values. In order to be a good American, you have to have a certain kind of value system, usually white, Christian, Protestant, etc. That notion, for me at least, is not acceptable. because these people who advocate that have proven that they don't believe in those values themselves. They have neglected all of those values with the election of Donald Trump and even prior to Donald Trump. So that's the position I take, although we have to be aware and be very studious about the power that they have and the control that they have, but not to give them psychological advantage when they don't deserve it.
Thank you for that, Brother Rod. Yeah, I agree with all the points you're making, and a lot of the responses. Well, a lot of the part of that you talked about of the African American Muslim community and our, our Nabi Muhammad community. A lot of that I discuss in detail in my book. So I tried not to bring as much of that into this as I could, but all your points very well taken.
I don't have a question, Brother Bill. I just have a comment. Just thinking about the atmosphere and culture of fear uh, that is permeating students in Chicago public schools, their families, and schools outside of Chicago with these raids. And your comment about families not sending their kids to school, not showing up to work. That's real. And I think that's one of the things that it's the human cost. I mean, we hear these things on the news. It's kind of like, oh, that's unfortunate. But they are real, living, breathing human beings, families, people who are really going to be impacted by, Trump's policies as it relates to immigration. It's just something for all of us to really think about and to make duas for those families who are going to be living in fear for who knows how long. And it's a really unfortunate situation.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important point. My daughter, who's a Chicago public school teacher, taught in little village, primarily high school, elementary school, and so on. And yeah, she talked about how many of the students were undocumented, and even during the summer, many would go back to Mexico and do their thing, and then come back here for the education. So that's not going to be happening. And she did talk about during those earlier times, uh, people just stayed. They stayed off the streets, and they did everything they could to not be noticed. So it's and that atmosphere of fear. It's just a terrible thing. I mean, you don't know you're going to be separated from your family or not, or your relatives, or what's going to happen. So, yeah, that community needs our doing. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
One,
All right. I'm looking. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
uh,
Brother Rod.
Brother Bill, we were talking about the potential raids on Chicago with the ICE agents, etc. And your topic was the religious and racial history of U.S. immigration. And when I read about that potential raid, I thought, well, why Chicago? Is there a racial component given that we have an African American mayor here? There are many other sanctuary cities that could have been chosen. Why Chicago?
Well, one overwhelming reason is because Trump hates Chicago. He's said that many times. We're just a crime-ridden city, and he certainly didn't like our last mayor, and he doesn't doesn't like our current mayor. Again, I would say because he's a racist, as we all know. So he's really using Chicago to be the first part of what people are describing his shock and awe. This is one city he wanted to get back at for a long time, and now here's his opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's unfortunate but true. All right, it is after 2 p.m. Again, on behalf of the Talim Committee and our resident imam, Tariq El-Amin. I want to thank Brother Bill for his willingness to continuously share his wisdom and his knowledge with our community as we advance our own education, our own knowledge about the happenings of the world. Thank you all for joining us. Those who were able to attend the Zoom live, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. And we thank those that, inshallah, will have an opportunity to visit YouTube, our YouTube channel, to watch this very important and informative Talim via YouTube. So I thank you all. Assalamu alaikum. I want to close out in prayer, inshallah. Walasa. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walasa. Inna al-insana lafi kusra. Ilay ladina amanu wa amilu salihati. Watwasah bil haq. Watwasah bis sabr. Amin.
Me.
I
Amin.
mean.
Awali.
Thank you very